Hello all, you're very welcome to another Saturday session here with ExamRevision.ie. My name's John and today we're going to be looking at junior cycle science with a focus on mixtures and solutions. Hopefully by the end of this lesson you'll have a much clearer idea of mixtures and solutions and be able to approach any exam questions with confidence. Before we dive into the chapter, we're just going to take a look here at the learning outcomes. So CW2 and CW4 are the learning outcomes associated with this chapter. So understanding mixtures and how we separate mixtures are key facets of this learning outcome. So a mixture is where we have two or more substances that are physically mingled together, which means they can be separated. But we need to understand what means or what technique of separation are we going to apply when we're separating particular substances. We also need to understand what a solution is and to be able to classify solutions. Just before we get into the real nitty-gritty of the chapter, what I do suggest is that you get an A4 sheet of paper and make a mind map for yourself based on solutions and mixtures. And as we're moving through this topic and learning new pieces of information, we can add to this mind map. And at the end of the lesson, you'll have a lovely set of condensed notes based on the solutions and mixtures. And this helps you actively learn during the lesson, while also reinforcing what we've learned throughout the lesson. So a few pieces of terminology to be aware of before we move any further. A solute is a substance that has been dissolved. So for example, salt is a prime example of a solute. Salt and sugar are our two go-to solutes. Our solvent is the liquid that is doing the dissolving. So water, and I'm going to put a wee circle around water here to specialize and to really identify the importance of understanding that water is our solvent, our example of a solvent. So when we add our salt into our solvent, we form a solution. And a solution is a mixture of a solute and a solvent. So if you think about it when you're making a cup of tea, and the cup of tea contains obviously a large amount of water, and we add our sugar into the cup of tea, the sugar is being dissolved in that cup of tea. It's not the cup of tea being dissolved in the sugar. So our example of a solute is a sugar or a salt because they are the substances that are actually being dissolved. Whereas a solvent is the liquid that actually dissolves the solutes. So solvent, we're thinking water all the time. And again, this is just a visual showing that when we add a solute to the solvent, we get a solution. So if we add salt plus our water, we get a salt solution. Or sugar plus our water, we get a sugar solution. So this is just showing formation of a sugar solution. So our solute, again, we're thinking solute is a substance that we are dissolving. So sugar is added into our beaker of water. And again, we're thinking water, we're thinking is our solvent. So when we add a solute to a solvent, we get a solution. In this case here, sugar is dissolved in the water. We cannot see any sugar sitting at the bottom of that beaker, which means all the sugar must have been dissolved. Okay, so we've been introduced to our solutions, and we hopefully understand that our solution is made up of two things. It's made up of a solute, and hopefully you're recalling to yourself that it's also made up of a solvent. So these are the two components of a solution. And hopefully we're recalling to ourselves that our example of a solvent is always going to be water. And in this particular case that we see here on the screen, our example of a solute, the substance that is dissolving in the water, is salt. And we need to be able to differentiate between a dilute solution and a concentrated solution. And the way we're going to describe it is comparing the amount of solute that we have to the amount of solvent. And we're going to use the words a small amount and a large amount. So if we look at dilute solution, let's talk about solvent. So in this dilute solution, do we have a large amount of solvent or a small amount of solvent? Hopefully you're concluding that at this point here, we have large amount of solvent. If we're comparing it to the amount of solute in this case, do we have a large amount of solute in a dilute solution or a small amount of solute in a dilute solution? And again, hopefully you're coming to the conclusion that we have a small amount of solute in a dilute solution. Now let's compare this with a concentrated solution. And remember again, what a solution contains is a solute and also solvent. So we're going to now compare the amount of solvent and the amount of solute in this concentrated solution to what we've looked at in the dilute solution. So again, is our salt our solvent or a solute? We know that the salt is our solute. So do we have a large amount of solute or a small amount? And of course, from the diagram, we can conclude that we have a large amount of solute. Again, let's relate this to what we have on the other side. In this case here, we have a large amount of solvent and a small amount of solute in dilute solution. We cannot have a large amount of solvent and a large amount of solute in the one solution. So therefore, if we're looking at the concentrated solution now, we've got a large amount of solute in a small amount of solvent. So hopefully you're with me so far, and hopefully you're now describing a dilute solution as a solution that contains a small amount of solute in a large amount of solvent. Hopefully when we're referring now to a concentrated solution, we're referring to a solution that has a large amount of solute in a small amount of solvent. And again, our key factor here to help us remember is our water. That is our solvent. If we can remember that water is our solvent, hopefully it'll keep us on a right track. So we're going to reinforce dilute and concentrated solutions. Again, hopefully after the last slide, you have a decent understanding of what a dilute solution is and what a concentrated solution is. So a dilute solution has a small amount of solute in a large amount of solvent. And again, if we look at visually here, and we look at our dilute solution, and our wee red balls, they represent our sugar or our salt, which is our solute. We've got a very small amount of solute in a large amount of solvent, which is our water. If we look at a concentrated solution, this has a large amount of solute in a small amount of solvent. So here, again, the red balls represent your sugar or your salt, which is your solute, in a small amount of solvent. And our solvent, again, of course, is going to be our water. So in beaker A, compared to beaker B, we've a lot less solute. So this is the equivalent of you having 100 milliliters of water and adding in 2 or 3 grains of salt. In B, this is the equivalent of you having 100 milliliters of water and adding in 50 grams of salt. We've got lots of solute here in B, therefore it's concentrated, where we've only a small amount of solute in A. So we're going to move on and look at saturated solutions. And we're going to talk about how solutions can reach their saturation point. And we describe the saturated solution as one which contains as much dissolved solute as possible at a given temperature. So to put that into context and to relate it to our own life, I'm sure at some point you've had a cup of tea and you want a wee bit of sugar in it. So you add in a teaspoon of sugar and you taste it and you're not content with how sweet it tastes. So you add in another teaspoon of sugar, you taste it again and you think, no, I want more sweetness. I want another teaspoon of sugar. So you add in your third teaspoon of sugar, you stir it like you have previously, you taste it, you're happy out, and you drink the cup of tea. At the end of the cup of tea, when you've removed and you've drank all the liquid, you notice that there's a clump of sugar that is left at the bottom of the cup. Now that sugar is undissolved sugar. That did not dissolve in the tea. And the reason why is because that solution had reached its saturation point. It was a saturated solution where at that particular temperature that cup of tea was at, no more solute will dissolve. So we will reach a point where no more sugar will dissolve in your cup of tea. And again, we can kind of relate this to a sponge. If you were putting on a bath and you put the sponge into the bath and you soak the sponge with water, if you lift that sponge up in the air, water will drip out of it because that sponge is saturated with water. It can only hold a certain amount of water. So it will, of course, hold on to a lot of water, but there's some water particles it just cannot hold because it is saturated. It contains as much water as it possibly can, whereas a saturated solution contains as much solute as it possibly can. I'm just going to get you to put another wee marker beside your given temperature. So for example, if I had sugar added to a cup of tea where the temperature of the cup of tea was 20 degrees. So I'll just write this here for you. So we're going to look at 20 degrees. And I add sugar to 20 degrees. And I add sugar to a cup of tea at 40 degrees. And I add sugar to a cup of tea at 80 degrees. Now we know we need to keep everything constant, bar the temperature in this experiment, because we don't want anything else to affect the results. So if I add 5 grams of sugar to a cup of tea at 20 degrees, will it dissolve quicker than the sugar would at 40 degrees or at 80 degrees? So which of the three would you expect to dissolve the sugar the quickest? Temperature of 20 degrees, 40 degrees, or 80 degrees? Hopefully you're concluding that at 80 degrees, we would dissolve the most of this sugar. At 20 degrees, you might only dissolve 1 gram of sugar. At 40 degrees, you might only dissolve 1.4 grams of sugar. At 80 degrees, you may dissolve 2 grams of sugar. And of course, in this case, we need to keep the amount of tea the same. So we'll say 500 mils of tea. So keep the tea the same. We keep the amount of sugar added the same. And what we're changing is the temperature of the tea. So at these points here, each of these temperatures, they will have their own saturation point with regards to the amount of sugar dissolved. As we increase the temperature, more sugar will dissolve. As we increase the temperature again, more sugar will dissolve. So again, we're going to relate this to the previous example that we looked at. So we had 5 grams of sugar in the previous example. And we're going to look at how could we dissolve more of that 5 grams of sugar. And one way we looked at that we could dissolve more of this sugar is increase the temperature. So in the previous example, we increased the temperature from 20 degrees to 40 degrees. And we dissolved more of this sugar than we did at 20 degrees. And we then increased the temperature to 80 degrees. And of 5 grams of sugar, we dissolved more of that than we had at 40 degrees and than we had at 20 degrees. Another means of increasing the amount of dissolved sugar or the solubility of the sugar, and that refers to the amount of sugar that can be dissolved. at a certain temperature, we could also increase the volume of the solvent. So if you remember in the previous diagram, we had 5 grams of sugar. We had, hypothetically, again, we're using a big figure for the tea, but we had 500 mils of tea. So how could we increase, apart from increasing temperature, how could we increase the amount of this sugar dissolved? What we could do is increase the amount of tea. So how about if we had 1 liter of tea? We could therefore dissolve more of this sugar if we had 1 liter of tea than if we had only 500 milliliters, which is only half a liter. So there's 2 possible ways that we can increase solubility. We can increase the volume of the solvent, because remember our tea contains no water as our solvent at this point, or we could increase the temperature. I'm going to look now at separating mixtures. So what actually is a mixture? A mixture is where we have 2 or more substances mingled together physically, but not chemically combined. And it's very important to understand this can be reversed. We can separate mixtures. Whereas when we're looking at something that is chemically combined, such as a compound, is it extremely difficult, if not impossible, to separate something that is chemically combined together. Whereas physically, in a mixture, we can separate them. So a couple of more pieces of terminology I want you to be aware of. What does soluble mean? Soluble means that a substance will dissolve in a solvent. So e.g. we put in there, again, if you think about substances that can dissolve in a liquid or in a solvent, salt and sugar. So again, we can add this into our mind map. What do we mean by a substance that is soluble? It can dissolve in a liquid. An insoluble substance is a substance that will not dissolve in a solvent, e.g. sand or clay or stones or any number of objects that you might have in your pencil case. If you put in your pencil pair into water, it's not going to dissolve. So based on this concept, we need to understand how we might separate sugar and water and how that might differ from the way we might separate sand and water. So we're going to be referring to soluble substances or soluble solids, which are solids that will dissolve in a solvent, and we're going to be referring to insoluble solids, which are solids that do not dissolve in a liquid, particularly when we're talking about water. Some examples of mixtures that are very, very common is seawater, and it contains salt and water. So if you go to the sea and you get some of the water in your eye, you'll notice that it's quite stingy. And the reason why is because that water contains salt. If you go to a lake and you put some water onto your face, that water won't sting. Because it's a very, very low concentration, if any, of salt in that particular water. Air contains a number of different gases. Oxygen, nitrogen, CO2 are only 3 of some of the many gases that we can find in air. And again, we need oxygen for respiration. And we know that it's not chemically combined to nitrogen because we only breathe in oxygen for respiration. We do actually breathe in nitrogen as well, but we don't use it for respiration. So therefore, we can conclude that they're not combined chemically together. They're only physically mingling with each other within the air. Sand and water, again, are another example of a mixture. And notice the difference between it and salt and water. That salt is dissolved within the water in that case here, whereas sand and water, they do not dissolve together. They will mix together, but the sand won't dissolve in water, so we can separate it in a different way than we will separate salt water. And green ink is a mixture of blue and yellow ink as well. And mixtures are usually easy to separate when the correct separation technique is used. Just to remind you that mixtures, we're talking about a physical mingling. Whereas when we're talking about a compound, we're talking about chemically bonding together. Whereas here it's only physical, so we can separate them. So think about if you had a basin of water and stones. Stones are in the basin of water. How might we separate them? How might we get the water into another basin and keep the stones in that initial basin? we would simply hold on to the stones and filter out the water. And what we're doing there essentially is filtration, which is a process we're going to look at in a few minutes. So a few separation techniques we're going to look at: 1, filtration; 2, chromatography; 3, evaporation; and 4 is distillation. So we'll take a look at these now. So the first process we're going to look at is filtration. And filtration is separating an insoluble solid from a liquid. Remember, what does insoluble mean? It means it will not dissolve in a solvent. So this means water and sand are a primary example of where we would use filtration. If you think about your pasta and your water, so you're boiling your pasta on the hob, and we want to separate the pasta and the water. That pasta does not dissolve in the water. So we could use a filtering system where we add in the pasta and the water to the sieve. The pasta remains in the sieve and the water goes down into the other saucepan. In that case, we are undergoing a process called filtration. We could not use this process to separate sugar and water, because sugar is dissolved within the water. And if you imagine adding water into this funnel, the water containing the sugar would simply flow down into the flask below. Whereas here, if we have sand and water, this filter paper will trap the sand, because the sand particles are too big to pass through the filter paper, and they're also not dissolved in the water. They're merely mingled physically with the water. So what we would be left with when we have our funnel and we put our filter paper inside it, which contains only tiny holes that will allow water to pass through, but not the sand, we'll be left with the sand held on the filter paper, and the water will flow through down into the beaker down below. And if you look this up on YouTube, there's lovely videos that show we can get very clear water passing through here from filtration. The next type of separation technique we're going to look at is chromatography. And chromatography involves separating ink or dye into different colors. So you may have used this in school using a special type of paper called chromatography paper. And chromatography paper essentially allows ink within a certain dye to be separated. So what we may have done in school is we have chromatography paper and we dip it into water. Now just below the bottom of the chromatography paper, we put a line using pencil. And the lead from the pencil won't dissolve in the water, but in the center of the line of the pencil, we make a dot using a water-soluble marker. And what will happen is that the ink that is contained within this particular marker will rise up the paper and separate into its different colors. It's a very interesting experiment to do, and it shows us how we can separate ink within a dye into its separate colors. This visual here shows us the fantastic array of colors that can arise from different colored markers. And again, this is something that you may have done in school. Notice that the line we have made is made of pencil, because that lead will not dissolve in the water and will not affect our results. Whereas each of these markers are water-soluble markers, which means that the ink will dissolve in the water, and using this special type of chromatography paper, the ink will separate. So you notice the colors arising from red compared to the colors arising from black. In this separation technique, evaporation involves the changing of a liquid into a gas. That's how we refer to the change of state, where we're going from a liquid into a gas. However, this process can be used to separate a soluble solid from a liquid. And we're going to ask a recall question now. What do we mean by a soluble solid? A soluble solid refers to a solid that will dissolve in a solvent. So for example, again, our friend sugar. And we're going to dissolve this sugar into the water. So how can we separate these in the lab? We could place our beaker of sugar and water onto a hot plate. We turn up the hot plate, we evaporate the water, and what's going to happen is the water is going to escape in the form of the gas. So gas will be seen leaving the beaker, and that's bringing the water with it until eventually we're just left with the sugar in the beaker, no more water. However, in this case, essentially, the gas has escaped. So the liquid has actually been lost, essentially, in the form of a gas. So we haven't retained both the liquid and the soluble solid. We have two components here, the soluble solid and the liquid. But we only have one of them at the end. We only have the soluble solid, which is the sugar. So this process here, it is essentially a way of separating both of them, but we will only retain one of them at the end, which will be the solid. This image on the left demonstrates the apparatus we might use in a lab to separate our soluble solid from a liquid. So again, we could use our Bunsen burner, we could use our hot plate to again apply heat to the solution. So in here we have our salt solution or our sugar solution. And using an evaporating basin, we can evaporate all the water from this solution to just leave us with salt. Again, in this case here, we are losing the liquid. So you may want to have a separation technique where we retain both the soluble solid and the liquid at the end of the process. So if your mixture is in solution, such as salty water, filtering it will not separate the salt from the water. Because remember, the salt is dissolved within the water, and that salt will pass through the filter paper in filtration if we use that process. So that would not be the correct process. Whereas here we can actually separate them. This is possible because water and salt have different boiling points. Water will evaporate at 100 degrees, where salt will not evaporate at 100 degrees. And that is why the salt is left behind. In the previous example of a separation technique, evaporation, we focused on separating a soluble solid from a liquid. And in this process, distillation, we will also use it to separate a soluble solid from a liquid. However, in this case, we're going to keep both of them. We're going to retain both the soluble solid and the liquid. Whereas in evaporation alone, we will only have the soluble solid at the end. So distillation is the vaporization of a liquid followed by the condensing of the vapor by cooling. So essentially within distillation, we have two processes almost. We have evaporation and condensation. And if you think back to your states of matter, condensation is the changing of a gas into a liquid. So gas to a liquid. That's what condensation is. So what we're doing is initially we're changing a liquid into a gas in evaporation, but then we're actually changing it back from a gas into a liquid. We can also use distillation to separate two liquids, such as alcohol and water. And again, this is possible as alcohol and water have different boiling points. In alcohol's case, the boiling point of alcohol is 78 degrees, and in water's case, its boiling point is 100 degrees. So if we heat our solution to 80 degrees, we can definitely evaporate the alcohol, whereas we will be left with water behind because it does not reach its boiling point of 100 degrees. So this process will allow us to retain our both liquids, and it also will allow us to retain our soluble solid from a liquid, separating if we so wish. So we're going to look at distillation. We're going to look at an apparatus called a Liebig condenser. And again, we want to focus on this word condenser, condensation. And what does that mean? Again, condensation, we're converting a gas back into a liquid. So that's what we're going to do here in this particular container, the Liebig condenser. I want us to focus firstly on what we have in this particular experiment. We have seawater. And again, look at seawater as a mixture. It's physically mingled together substances. So the two components of seawater, of course, are our salt and our water. So we can separate them using distillation, or of course we could use evaporation either. We could not use filtration in this case here because the salt is dissolved within the water and it would pass through the filter paper. So what we do is we apply heat to the seawater solution. And of course, if we apply heat to the seawater solution, some of that water is going to evaporate. The evaporate will rise up through this container. It will enter the Liebig condenser as a gas. So the steam, which is the gas, will enter the condenser. And remember what we describe condensation as, or condenser as. It's the changing of a gas into a liquid. So the gas will move down the Liebig condenser, and the Liebig condenser is kept cold. So when a gas hits a cold surface, it will change back into a liquid. So in this point here, X, in the Liebig condenser, we now have this gas that has risen up, been changed back into a liquid. And this liquid will flow down here and be found in the conical flask B. So the distilled water here is pure. They contain no substance dissolved in it. So this conical flask does not contain any of the salt that was in this initial conical flask. So just to repeat that and to reinforce, we have salt and water here. We heat it. The water will evaporate, the salt won't. So all the water will leave and move up through this container. It will move down this passageway here into the Liebig condenser. Again, focusing on the fact that this is a condenser, where this steam will be changed back into a liquid. It will flow down here and the liquid will end up in the conical flask. And now we have the salt over here, which the solid is left here, and the liquid over in the conical flask. So the solid will not move. And now through distillation, we have successfully managed to separate a soluble solid, which is salt, from the liquid, which is water in this case. So looking at a recap of the different processes, we're looking at filtration, evaporation, chromatography, and distillation. When we're talking about separating sand and water, how would we describe sand? Would we describe sand as an insoluble substance or a soluble substance? So can we dissolve sand in water? Of course we cannot dissolve it in water. So we're not going to be able to use chromatography because it's not ink. We're not going to be able to use distillation because it's not a soluble solid. And we're not going to be able to use evaporation because again, it's not a soluble solid. So sand is insoluble. So we use filtration to separate an insoluble solid from a liquid. If we're looking at evaporation, we're going to think about a soluble solid such as sugar or such as salt. In evaporation, we will not get both substances remaining. We will lose the liquid. And this is where distillation comes in, where we can now use a process involving the Liebig condenser, where we will get the solid remaining in the flask and the liquid moving over into the beaker or into the conical flask, whatever apparatus it may be. So we're going to look at an exam question and attempt to give a good go at it based on what we've learned. So just going to draw a beaker of water here, and I'm going to label salt and sand within the water. So we've salt and we've sand. And the first question is asking us that when we add sand and salt to hot water, so a mixture of sand and salt is added to hot water. So I'm going to say that this water is at 70 degrees. If we add in the salt at this point here, what will happen to the salt when we add it to hot water? And if you think back to your cup of tea and your sugar, because salt and sugar behave the same in water, what will happen? hopefully you're concluding that this water will dissolve the salt. So the salt at this point is dissolving. The next part of the question looks at removing sand from the mixture. So we have sand, salt and water. Now remember, the salt has dissolved into the water at this point. So what separation technique could we use to separate the sand from the salt and the water? Now bear in mind that sand is our example of an insoluble substance, which means it won't dissolve in the water. So what separation technique can we use to separate an insoluble solid from a liquid? And hopefully again you're thinking of your diagram of filtration, where the filter paper will collect the sand but allow the dissolved salt and water to pass through. So our example here is filtration. The final stage of the experiment is to get the salt on its own. So we've now successfully removed the sand. So I'm going to rub out the sand here. And now we're just left with the salt and water. So how can I successfully just get the salt on my own? I do not want the water to be involved. So what can I do? What separation technique will allow me to just get the salt on its own? And hopefully now you're running through your different separation techniques and coming up with either one of two examples: distillation or evaporation. And of course, in an exam, you would only need to give one of these. One of these answers will suffice because both of them are correct. So distillation or evaporation can then be used to separate the final two substances and get the salt on its own. So this is just a marking scheme that we could potentially come across in the junior cert. For this particular question, again, the salt dissolves when added to hot water. Filtration is used to separate the sand from the salt water mixture, and then evaporation and distillation could be used to get the salt on its own, separated from the water at the end. The next question we're looking at relates to distillation. So the separation technique we're talking about here is distillation. So we're going to read the question carefully and underline key parts of the question that are going to tell us the information needed to answer the question. So the diagram shows an apparatus used to purify a sample of water containing impurity X, which is a solid. So impurity X is going to be over here. So we've got our water and our impurity X here. So we're asked to name the separation technique, which is distillation, and name the piece of apparatus labeled C. So if you remember your diagram, and hopefully you've drawn a wee diagram for yourself on your mind map, this part here that we looked at involves a change of state where we have our gas rising up here. And what does it do in this container? It condenses. So the container labeled C is called the Liebig condenser. And if we look at what the name of that actual apparatus is, if it's involved in condensing, we're looking at the change of state being from a gas back into a liquid. So a gas to liquid. Or you could talk about steam back into water. Or condensation would also be accepted. Which arrow A or B points to the location of most of the impurity X at the end of the process? So impurity X, remember, is your solid. That's what impurity X is. So in which container, A or B, would we expect to find the solid? So thinking about this as being salt and water, undergoing distillation, where would we expect to find the salt at the end of the process? And hopefully you're concluding that the salt will remain in container A, which is the solid in A, because the water is going to evaporate and condense in the Liebig condenser and end up in B. So your answer there is A. Again, if we take a look at our marking scheme, the first process we're asked to show and name the process that we were shown in the diagram was distillation. The apparatus that was labeled C was the condenser, the Liebig condenser. You were asked to explain the change of state that happens there, and we said that it was the gas changing back into a liquid. And impurity X, which contained the solid, so in the case that we described there, was the salt would remain in A, and the water would evaporate and end up in container B. The final question we're going to look at relates to what we did at the start of the lesson today. A group of students investigated the solubility of different substances in water. You were asked to describe the term that is used to describe a liquid which is used to dissolve substances. So what term at the start of the lesson did we use to describe water? Because it is used to dissolve sugar and salt. So the term we used, hopefully you're answering, is a solvent. Water is always our example of a solvent. While investigating the solubility of copper sulfate in water, the students found that after adding a large mass of copper solute to the water, some of it did not dissolve. So there's a key part of the question. Some of it did not dissolve, we're told. So think back to your sugar in your cup of tea. Even after we stored it and we shook it, what term is used to describe a solution that contains as much dissolved solute as possible at a certain temperature? And we used the example of a sponge where we dipped it into the water and some of the water would drip out of the sponge because it was undergoing or it had reached a certain point. So what type of solution are we describing where it contains as much dissolved solute as possible? And hopefully your answer to that is a saturated solution. Outline the step the students could have taken to make more of the copper sulfate dissolve. Now we need to understand the role of the copper sulfate in this experiment. So the water we know is the solvent. So we know that within the solution, that is the solvent, the water. So therefore, what is the copper sulfate? What does it represent within the solution? The copper sulfate is the solute. So essentially what they're asking there in that question is, how could we get more solute dissolved in this experiment? So I want you to think back again to our example of our sugar and our water. And how did we get more, or sugar in our tea? How did we get more of that sugar dissolved in our tea? What did we do in that experiment? So there's two things we could do. One is increase the temperature. And the second thing we could do is increase the volume of water. So that's how we could increase the solubility of the solute by increasing the temperature and increase the volume of water. Because remember, we think back to our tea and our sugar. How do we ensure that more of the 5 grams of sugar was dissolved? We increased the amount of tea, which was increase the volume of water, and we also increased the temperature to 80 degrees. And our marking scheme will show that the term used to describe water is a solvent. A solution that will dissolve no more solute at a certain temperature is known as a saturated solution. And 2 ways we could increase the solubility or the amount of copper sulfate that is dissolved would be to increase the temperature or heat the solution and add more water. So folks, that's the end of the solutions and mixtures chapter. Hopefully your understanding of this particular chapter has increased throughout the lesson, and hopefully you have a nice condensed mind map for yourself to use as a revision tool going forward for your mock exams and your junior cert in June. Just before we go, just like to remind you to follow us on social media. We've got the following social media channels over a number of different sites and a number of different apps.